It's fascinating, Tom, in that these are arguments which you sort of hear on the periphery, but you don't actually hear from government, certainly not the opposition at the moment, and yet it would seem that he is making valid points.
Absolutely, and I think one of the most incisive points of that interview was when we got to sort of look behind the curtain of government and look and see sort of how it was all working at that time. The most remarkable words from Jacob Rees-Mogg to me at that point were, we all had to pretend that the Bank of England was doing remarkably well. That almost sort of peels back the curtain in terms of what ministers are told to say. In order to protect the independence of the Bank of England, ministers are not allowed to criticise the Bank of England or point out when glaring policy errors have been made in their view by the Bank of England. That's the sort of collective responsibility that befalls a government, and it is fascinating to see that once a minister has been relieved from their post, is free from that sense of collective responsibility, we can see what was really going on. What people in the building behind me, perhaps in private cabinet meetings, were really discussing at the time, because there does seem to be a great sense, certainly from senior figures within the Liz Truss administration, that the Bank of England had let the country down, had let inflation run rampant, had not stuck to its only mandate of keeping inflation to 2%, and had dillied and dallied in terms of delaying interest rate rises, meaning when those rate rises did come, they perhaps had to be more extreme and more painful than if they'd have gone earlier.
In with the argument that we do often hear, Tom, that of course this isn't just a UK problem, it's a global problem, and so therefore can't you say, well, the Bank of England behaved the same way as other central banks?
You certainly can. We're seeing the European Central Bank in the European Union and the Federal Reserve in the United States performed exactly the same kind of quantitative easing well into the pandemic. You had too much money chasing too few goods. That's not a quote from me, that's a quote from Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, speaking a few weeks ago, saying that big mistakes were made not only by the Bank of England, but, as I say, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank as well. Digital money printing led to a considerable degree of this inflation. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other causes of Of course, the situation with international energy is a big factor. The war in Ukraine feeding into that, and indeed the stuttering, stopping and restarting of international industry in the aftermath of COVID as well. This all feeds into a bit of a perfect storm, but it would be remiss to ignore the role that central banks did play. However, one crucial point I think that it is worth mentioning is that once everyone realised the mess we were all in, the Federal Reserve in the United States was faster than the Bank of England in terms of raising rates. It went further and it went faster, and as a result, inflation in the United States is now lower than it is in the United Kingdom. Potentially, there needs to be more scrutiny. This certainly seemed to be what I understood Jacob Rees-Mogg to be saying. There needs to be more scrutiny of the way in which our central banks perform, just as we scrutinise the way in which our politicians perform.